Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit here from the last module. We've been dealing with HTML and then layering CSS on top of it to provide a method of making sense of websites and suggesting how they should look. We're going to move on to now something called Web Content Management Systems. So first I wanted to take a moment and kind of give you a bit of a preview as to what a CMS is. So what is a CMS? A CMS is a piece of software that sits on your web server. So far we've only been putting static files up on our web server and then using the web to go and access those static files. Now we're going to start putting programs up on our web server and then access those programs through a web browser. And what a CMS does, and it's kind of a vague description, there's lots of things that do this, but what it basically does is it provides a bit of a programmatic approach to the content that you're trying to show people. So rather than design separate static web pages for every piece of content, that is, go in by hand or automatically in some sense and create a separate web page for each page that you need, if you have similar visual presentations of some of these pages, instead you can design a template and then use a CMS to deliver some content through those templates or that template or that theme when it's a number of templates put together. So at a very basic level, that's what a CMS is. It's a templating system, but it provides lots of other things too. So let's go through 3 or 4 things that CMSs do for us and why we might be interested in them. One thing that a CMS does is it allows you to maintain a site more easily without going into the HTML and fishing around and changing things. If you have a misspelling on a page, the last thing you want to do is bring in your HTML guy to go in and find that misspelling in the HTML page and then fix it and then save it. And believe me, when you give regular users HTML pages to edit, they will mess them up. For a long time, one of the most common complaints you'd hear from clients is, I knew I had budgeted for it, I realized that I had to spend $15,000 to put together a decent website. What I didn't realize is that I'd have to spend another $1,000 a month to go back to the designers and have them change little pieces of content. If I change a date, I don't want to have to spend $100 in developer time to do that. So there's kind of a demand on the client side at this point, an expectation that you'll give them a system that they can change the content of fairly easily. Because even though, back in the day, which was probably the early 1990s, if you designed a website, there was some expectation that the content itself would be static through, say, a year, and the design would be static for a year, and that wasn't a problem. And that's no longer the case. Even if your design remains stable for an entire year, we'll talk about that in a second, one of the things CMSs can do is give you some change in design in that time period. But even if the design remains stable, there's no way the content remains stable. In a website that you want people actually visiting, it's unlikely that the web content will remain stable from day to day or week to week. So you need a way to kind of update that easily and maintain it easily, even if you're not technologically adept or you're not a web designer. And so that's one thing that CMSs do. They provide a management function so that people that have a login can go in the back end and kind of change things around. Second thing they do is they provide a way of organizing very large collections of content. So think about, for example, a university. You probably don't have just a few web pages. You probably have tens of thousands of web pages. And you have tens of thousands of little pieces of information that are kind of disparate, right? You might have courses as a kind of information, and you might have hundreds of courses, and each of those courses have little attributes, right? They're offered by a particular department, they're worth a certain number of credits, they're only offered in certain semesters, they have a course description associated with them, they might have instructors associated with them. So you've got like little pieces of each of this piece of data, but that chunk, that type of data is only one of a number of types of data that a standard university system would have to handle. It would have to handle, faculty data, it would have to handle student data, it would have to handle programs and courses, and so there's all of these kinds of pieces of data that it needs to present to the web user in some kind of a sensible way. So one of the things that good CMSs provide is some sort of taxonomy for controlling those things. This is associated with the maintenance kind of piece, but another thing that it allows you to do is give certain people certain levels of access, so that there is a little bit of authentication and of roles for different people. You don't want to, if you have a department secretary, you want that person to be able to create and change the pages that are associated with his department, not necessarily with the entire university website, right? So you should be able to kind of range in where people can change and give them particular roles. Finally, and this becomes much more important over the last few years, in many cases some of those users are not just people that work for the company doing a kind of an outward-facing or a front-facing website. They're people that are part of the community. You're trying to create some sort of online social community, social networking structures, and the ability to upload user-created content. All of these things become much more important, and a lot of these things come up over and over again, and it seems stupid to redesign, to reinvent the wheel if this is something that seems to happen all the time. So, because web developers are lazy, and that's a good thing, we try to reuse code. And a lot of that reuse of code turned into systems that could be distributed and used by different people on their sites. Now, you're probably familiar with a number of content management systems. A lot of you have worked in media, and so you probably run across a number of content management systems. There's literally hundreds, maybe thousands of different content management systems out there. We're going to be focusing on, for example, if you're in the ICM program at Quinnipiac, the student site is on a SharePoint server, and that's a content management system made by Microsoft for Microsoft servers. We're going to be focusing on 3 open source pieces of software. We're going to be looking at WordPress, at Joomla, and at Drupal. And you've run into WordPress before, I'm sure. You've probably run into all 3 of them before to a greater or lesser degree. I'm going to talk real quick about Joomla here. It's kind of maybe the odd one out because we're not going to talk so much about Joomla. And part of the reason for that is WordPress is a very lightweight system. It was designed, obviously, as a blog to start with. And over time, it's evolved a lot of pieces that make it usable as something like a lightweight CMS. And that's why we're talking about it. A lot of organizations are realizing they just don't have huge amounts of content, that they have a fairly modest amount of content, but that WordPress provides a nice back end that gives them some of the maintenance and other kinds of utility that makes sense. And so, some of the functions, some of the features, things like a built-in RSS feed, so you don't have to write your own, things like commenting systems, things like a plugin structure and themes that you can use. So a lot of people are saying, oh, well, I'm going to put up a website. Their first instinct, and I'm among those people, is to say, oh, why don't you just use WordPress to back it up? So, for very simple systems, WordPress makes a lot of sense. For very complicated systems, Drupal makes sense. So Drupal is in some ways sort of the ultimate Swiss Army knife, right? It's got, at its basic level, it's just kind of a pretty basic structure, but with the use of plugins and modules and themes, it can be extended to do just about anything. And it has a huge developer community and lots of people doing fairly interesting things with it. Some very simple modules that extend it, and then fairly extensive modules that build on it to the point where it's hardly recognizable as Drupal anymore. And so we're going to be looking at the other end, kind of at the most extreme end on that end, of sites that can be extended and be fairly extensive, that is, handle fairly large pieces of data efficiently and can scale.